Welcome to the Entrepreneur Stories podcast. Jonathan Herps is your host. He is a strategic advisor, coach, and mentor to entrepreneurial founders, business owners, and CEOs. In this podcast, he chats with entrepreneurs, founders, and CEOs of scaling companies. It centers around their entrepreneurial journey so far and their aspirations for their companies.
Hi there. Welcome again to my Entrepreneur Stories podcast. It's my great pleasure today to introduce Ali Besiso, who's Managing Director of iCIMS. And Ali, I might get you to explain what iCIMS is once we get going. So perhaps we could start. Why don't you tell us a bit about your entrepreneurial journey so far and about the company?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. Really appreciate sort of the opportunity to chat a little bit about what I still get caught out by when I get called an entrepreneur, because I see myself as the accidental entrepreneur. My background originally is more from a science background. So, I did a health sciences degree. I was specialized in anatomy and physiology, thought I was going to go down sort of the medical career path. Ended up pivoting during that period and staying in health, but doing a master's in health informatics, which is the digital health and technology side of health. And very quickly went into sort of startup world, but more as the sort of scientific / subject matter, technology guy who was working on, requirements and R&D and so on. But really what happened is that journey kind of sort of took its own path. I was employee number one, which is really interesting. You always hear about founders and you always hear about growth. I'm always like it's interesting that, that first couple of employees, the situation I ended up in, shapes sort of the future of the company in a way. Sort of a few years later, started taking more of the management pathway and recently completed my MBA because all of a sudden I found myself enjoying a lot more of the business tasks rather than the technical tasks. And I thought, what's happening to me? So that's sort of how I ended up generally in this space now, where I'm more sort of driving the businesses, driving the growth side of the business, more of the business side, and actually trying to sort of grow our team where I'm doing less of the projects on the ground, doing more of the business side of things.
Okay. So iCIMS, Innovative Clinical Information Management Systems. Yeah. Tell me what that means.
So when I was doing my master's in the digital health space, it was quite striking that with all the technology advancements in the world, like back then and now even more since COVID, but more so back then, health was always seen as sort of technology-wise, it's always behind. Like we've got the shiny apps here and there, and in finance and fintech was sort of taking off and all of that. But health always seemed to be caught in systems that are 20 and 30 years old, and we're doing things in the very old way. So really it was born out of this outcry of we need better systems in healthcare. We need better systems for clinicians. We need better systems for patients. So we actually went into sort of this R&D phase of trying to work out, well, what are the actual problems with usability of systems, of healthcare systems and hospitals, primarily doctor-facing systems in this case. And we sort of identified a sort of a major gap, not so much technologically, but methodologically, which is, most of these solutions off the shelf, all clinicians expected to have the exact same mental model. And, they were really sort of archaic in the way that they weren't adaptable. You couldn't really keep improving on these systems and changing workflows as health changes all the time. So we effectively created a clinical workflow platform as our core IP that really tackled that problem of creating user-friendly systems and systems that are very workflow-centric for clinical teams. That was effectively what was commercialized as part of iCIMS, and I'd say more so by accident, which is I'm sure we'll talk about this a bit later. We sort of, after a few years of going, hey, we can solve any clinical workflow problem, but we were told you're trying to do too many things, you're too distracted, so try to focus on an area of the market. And that sort of a few years later where our focus has become the oncology market. So effectively cancer services, cancer teams, any hospital with their cancer services, either department or entire sort of centers.
Okay, thank you. So if you had to start from scratch, you personally, Are there any aspects of personal leadership development you'd prioritize more?
So this is personally rather than at a company level?
Yeah, you personally.
I think it's coming from the background that I came from at the time, which is sort of very science and technology driven. I think just my vision was too narrow. I wasn't sort of at that time. I wish sort of the market education side of things, the business education side of things, that I was more aware or more proactive about it earlier on, because no one else in the business was. So the company founder also comes from a sort of a data science background and a tech background. And I think personally, I feel that, I've maybe had this sort of business interest all along, but it was almost like I was suppressing it. It's like, no, keep focusing on the sort of the scientific part of it and the technology part of it. If I had a time machine, I'd probably go back and do my MBA like maybe 4 years earlier than I actually did it, because it really opened my eyes to, successful companies are not purely about, even if they're tech companies, it's not purely about the tech. The tech is one element of an entire sort of working environment there.
It's you say that. You wouldn't want to do your MBA too early like I did. When I did my MBA, I'm showing my age. The internet wasn't even mentioned.
Right, yeah. It's funny, as I got to the end of my MBA, the course had already started changing. This is sort of so new subjects got sort of introduced, new subjects got removed and now became electives. And that's really just the pace of the world we live in now. Like all of a sudden, if you want to sign up for the MBA now as opposed to 3 years ago, a lot of the subjects are about the digital world. So since COVID.
And the really interesting thing from my perspective, with AI coming so much to the fore, the amount, I would use ChatGPT 10 times a day, both for my learning, for my my thought leadership content, and coaching clients. It's so much has changed in such a short period of time.
Yeah, certainly.
That's right. So tell me, how do you balance your personal life with the demands of running a business?
Personal life? What's that? I haven't heard that term before. No, it's interesting. I think I'm still a little bit fortunate in the sense that I do have a partner, but we don't have children. Not married yet, although I have been getting the tap on the shoulder about this, like since I finished my MBA now. So that certainly makes it easier. I am a bit of a workaholic, that's for sure. I'm a bit of a nerd who will still sort of, even if I'm not doing things that are work related directly, I'll be reading books or doing something like that. I've never had an issue with it, but perhaps in the last 3 years, it really became all in the sense that I was working full time, running sort of businesses on the ground, but also doing my MBA part time, so weeknights and weekends. So I probably reached my limit, and there was definitely signs of burnout there towards the end. But as of like sort of 6 months ago, I'm trying to maintain, like sort of create a healthier balance. It doesn't mean that I'm going to start at a certain time at a store at a certain time, but prioritizing things like actually exercising. And now that I've got my weekends back after the courses, making sure I do spend time with family and so on. But the reality of it is the brain is constantly ticking in the background, even if you're spending time personally.
That's called being an entrepreneur.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm still coming to terms with that, I think.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. One of the things I talk to my clients about is, and I learned this from a coach of mine, a guy called Dan Sullivan, and he talks about the entrepreneurial time system. And he talks about focus time, buffer time, and free time. And the focus time is, when you're working on the business, generating revenue. So for me, my focus time is actually coaching clients and hosting this podcast. My buffer time is preparing for all of that, but both business and my free time. My free time is really true free time when I'm trying not to think about the business. I'm a lot luckier than different to you. I've got 2 9-year-olds, so they do make me and I want to spend quality time with them and my wife. But I find it's I wrote a blog about it not long ago. The only time I really have really insightful ideas for my business is when I'm walking near the water or in the shower. And that free time is so important to actually, rejuvenate your mind. So it's I would encourage it, and I'm sure your partner would appreciate it too.
Oh, definitely, absolutely. But yeah, no, I totally resonate with that. It's funny how many times where I'd be in the middle of like a gym session, and all of a sudden a problem that I've been sitting there looking at my computer trying to solve for the last week, and all of a sudden you get the solution while you're walking out of the gym when I hadn't been thinking about it for an hour.
Exactly right. So tell me, employees, what qualities do you look for in employees, and how do you go about within the business fostering a positive culture?
That's a really, really interesting question, because I think in the startup world, it's not front of mind. It grows a little bit more organically. So it starts with a founder who, like my relationship with John Patrick, who's the co-founder of the company, came through the university. So it's almost like, the majority of the startup stories come from people knowing each other and going, let's start something. But then, as you start hiring employees, and as you find yourself starting to say things like, they've got to fit into our culture, and go, well, hang on, what is our culture? We never sat down and defined a thing called a culture. So a lot of it sort of grows organically, but interestingly, we're at a point in time now as we start growing and scaling the company a little bit more and merging what was really two separate entities there, thinking, okay, we actually need to be intentional about it, and we need to really define what it is. People will still wear multiple hats. So reflecting on it, I would actually say, there's a lot of people that have got the qualifications and the skills. But in the world that we live in, and in the fast pace of a small company, a startup company, really need people with a growth mindset. Like someone who's not so much wants to stay in a very specific lane and go, no, that is my job, that's all I'm doing, or going, oh, that's too hard, and so on. It's like, how are you going to receive sort of a new challenge, and how do you react to challenges, and so on. And growth mindset is one of those things. I'll admit, I used to think it's a bit of a fluffy word that, you hear in podcasts and whatnot. I really only came to terms with it probably in the last 3 years, because reflecting on myself, that's what I'm doing. As someone coming from a science background, going, no, I'm now going to actually sort of prioritize going and doing extra learning and pivoting and so on. That is what I realized in hindsight was a growth mindset. So you see it now in team members where you must throw something at them, and it doesn't, if they don't know, that's fine. It's more how you're going to approach that. I think that's a really important quality that is become a differentiator actually between people.
An interesting point you make, because it's a scientist, as I think of scientists as perfectionists, where as an entrepreneur growing a company with a growth mindset, speed is one of the key criteria, and an 80% solution is in fact a reasonable solution to get things done. So it's like there's quite a dichotomy between those two things when you're hiring staff in a scientific environment, I would think.
Well, you've just described the two voices that were screaming at each other inside my head during a period of time where I was coming to terms with that the solution doesn't have to be perfect. It's everything that sits around the solution, the relationship with the client, the land and expand, the agile methodology, all of that sort of, there was constantly two voices sort of saying the opposite things. Yeah.
No, it's an interesting one for you. So tell me, what do you think has been the biggest learning that you've had since you've been a business leader?
How much time have we got? The biggest. I think since becoming a business leader, that's sort of the context of the question is, as I've taken on that sort of directorship role and that company leadership role, it's almost like becomes a balance of our team internally. I'm spending a lot of time satisfying them almost internally as opposed to externally. It's really that shift of becoming, I'm about delivering client solutions and satisfying the external stakeholders. It really that shift to No, it's about actually satisfying the internal stakeholders and enabling the internal stakeholders to actually deliver, because that's the whole scalability thing. It can't be just me talking to every client. And that is a challenge, because you reach a point in that, any pre-existing clients has just been used to dealing with, me personally. That's who they want to continue to deal with. They don't want to be shifted over to someone else. So it becomes more as like with new clients, this like resistance of remove myself from the scene as much as possible and just make sure I'm just like more so opening a door, but really allowing our team to sort of step in, and for me to not have to be at every meeting. But it's not as simple as just stepping out. It's also about enabling like my team members and giving them the tools and sort of supporting them in the background. And I've actually found that really enjoyable. But that is the biggest learning, is that I used to sort of go reflect on my day or my week, go, I haven't really been productive this week because all I've done is internal stuff. And then I'm going, hang on, but that is sort of the biggest part of my job now. So,
yeah, it's interesting how your role changes as you grow with people and the complexity of people. I totally agree. And Ali, what do you see as the biggest, the main challenges for your business now and going forward?
Probably scalability. It's I'm sure it's not a unique problem. A lot of startup companies and small companies go through these phases, and I wish I know the statistics on this, but I've been told it's a very small minority as a startup business that makes it all the way to revenue generation and sustainability without external sort of venture capitalist investment or any big sort of loans or anything like that. So we sort of bootstrapped all the way to revenue generation and sort of having commercial, implementations and, modest success with big enough organizations. That's the upside. The downside is because we didn't really have investors that were constantly harassing us and, to satisfy them and so on. So that was the upside that allowed us to sort of be in control of our own destiny. The downside is without that external investment, you hit a ceiling. And now you're trying to sort of grow purely from your revenue. So you've got clients that you've got to sustain, but now you're trying to take the company to that next level. And it feels like, well, something exceptional needs to happen to take us to that next level, either an acquisition or now sort of a much more sort of mature type investment as opposed to early VC investment. And it's sort of, we're very much at this point of, figuring out the pathway. So in terms of satisfying our current clients and our current revenue and all of that, that's all sort of in a business as usual mode and going through organic growth. But if we really want to scale up, especially that we've got a couple of really high profile US clients, and without having staff in the US, it takes a certain level of, now we can't just wait for revenue to make that happen. We've got to do something ourselves to drive the company to the next level. That's the biggest challenge.
Okay. Well, maybe I can help a little bit there. If you remind me, I'll send you an ebook that I wrote on the challenges of CEOs and founders growing and scaling their businesses. Because one of the things, and there's some really good stats out there which actually equate to America, Europe, Mexico, South America, and Australia. And I'm just looking at my website, so if I'm looking over here, I apologise. But in all of those jurisdictions, 96.23% of companies fail to get over $2 million in revenue. Only 3%, therefore, get over $2 million in revenue. Only 0.5% of companies get over $10 million in revenue. And only 0.15 get over $25 million in revenue. Now, interestingly enough, those revenue numbers actually equate to staff numbers. So the complexity of growing a business all comes down to the complexity of the number of staff you've got.
Independent of industry?
Yeah, it doesn't matter. This is across all industries. So, yeah, this is across jurisdictions, across geographies, and across all industries. And so I've got this ebook, which like your comment about focus internally, it's interesting enough. That's one of the, a guy called Scott Tannis came up with this research. He sold his company in Canada, Western Digital, for about $465 million in 2013. And I've met Scott a couple of times, and he was fascinated by what stops companies scaling, and he calls it the valleys of death. And the valleys of death being, how do you take yourself from one level to the next? And in fact, that's really what my coaching business and coaching practice is all about. Now, I don't know, I haven't seen any stats on percentages, who've done it without outside funding. I do know, so I have a number of, we have clients who are bootstrapped, who are privately funded, who are debt funded, who are equity funded. Now, one of my clients recently moved his family to San Diego because he from a funding perspective, equity raising, he knew he had to be in America rather than Australia because they're so much further ahead with venture capital than Australia is. One of my other clients, I'd be very happy to introduce you to a VC here in Australia if you're interested, who I've recently met and have really impressed me, but just for a chat. It's the raising money is hard. And, one of those things I talk to my clients a lot about is, think about if you're raising money from venture capitalists, they have a very, very different timeline mindset than you as a founder or as, employee number one. They're looking to get their cash out quickly within 3 years, generally. And whether or not that suits your purpose and aspirations for the business and your founders, it's really hard. And, take it a step further and go to IPO, suddenly you're doing quarterly reporting and all of the changes it puts on your business. It's a really interesting dilemma.
And it's a very confronting conversation because it's not due to lack of trying. I mean, we've had a couple of sort of attempts at raising capital and, there is all that sort of bias and emotion is removed out of it when someone is coming in from the outside and looking at the business for what it is, and it becomes a very confronting conversation. And going back to something I said earlier, we did it at the time where, what do you mean, how big is our market? Like, look at the tech, look at the problem we're solving. Like, it's that sort of something. Okay, you're too basically immature. You're not ready for this sort of thing because, the business side of at least defining or the awareness of even like sort of where we are as a business and the market opportunities and the market size. And, if I give you money today, what would you do with it? And all of that was undefined for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I talk to my clients a lot about when they're talking about this journey is, it's all about having the right team around you and identified the extra leaders that you need, if you raise this money. And I talk a lot to clients about a strategic CFO. So I'm not talking about the average financial controller or accountant. I'm talking about someone who can strategically work with you to position the business for the fundraising. It's a function that most founders miss on the way through. We don't want to spend the money. We think we can do it all ourselves. All of this sort of stuff, but. Those key strategic advisors are absolutely critical. And they don't have to be full-time in the business. They can be fractional part-time guy. If you want to talk about that, Ali, I'm more than happy to share some learnings afterwards. So tell me, when you think of the word successful, which leader or entrepreneur comes to mind? And can you tell me why?
It's interesting. It's for me. It's seeing success stories. It's always like there's a person at the center of it who really sort of pushed the boundaries and had some sort of growth mindset. I think sports people in general are really like successful sports people or sports people that have a career after sports that become successful. I always sort of admire. I'm probably biased to it because I'm a bit of a sports fanatic, but I admire sort of sports people that have a really successful career, but then not fall off the cliff straight after it because they're always pivoting and like going, we've got to build our business, whether it's a media business, whether it's you see the David Beckhams of the world doing it. And it's like, you haven't fallen off a cliff after that, or you haven't sort of gone to a very dark pathway. Maybe on the business front more so, and this is probably recency bias, is that I follow Stephen Bartlett a lot. I'm really interested in the stuff that he does. And the Diary of a CEO is just such an incredible podcast, because it's not just about learning from one person. It's learning from every story that comes through. But sort of, again, he's someone who's pivoted constantly and hasn't had a traditional pathway. So I tend to think more of the people that haven't had a traditional pathway, which is surprising for someone like me who's come through a classic education system and science system, that I admire people who have a very, not unstable is not the right word, untraditional sort of pathway into success, and constantly pivoted and constantly were happy to take risks and so on. So that's probably someone that is sort of more fresh on my mind, because I've just finished listening to one of his books. So I sort of admire that type of character.
It's interesting. So, I mean, Beckham's really interesting. You know, there's a brand new
documentary,
Netflix documentary out. My wife's been watching it, as have my children, which is really, my 2 9-year-olds, so they're fascinated by it. The podcast Diary of a CEO out of the UK is I think the most watched podcast, at least in Europe, if not
in Europe. Yeah, it's at least the most watched in Europe.
So it's some really, really interesting lessons that come out that have come out of it. It's quite fascinating. Okay, well, thank you. Are you a reader, or you listen to podcasts? Any other books, podcasts, autobiographies you'd recommend?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been a reader, but like the sort of finishing my MBA, it's made me sort of pick up different types of things that I really like reading. And there's a lot of like sort of articles that are, you know, coming from the real world and real entrepreneurs. So Ed Catmull actually comes to mind. So he's the co-founder of Pixar, so Creativity Inc. But he's also written a lot of articles for Harvard Business Review. So we used to get those to read it, and I was just so like inspired by this, because like for a company like them, sort of you're thinking about the creative stuff they're creating, right? But he was talking about, well, how do you set up an environment of psychological safety to try the crazy ideas that they were trying at the time, to not shut it down and so on. Reed Hastings was the co-founder of Netflix. So there's a book called No Rules Rules, which is the book around the Netflix culture and how they sort of disrupted the industry. I do like that story, which is again the concept of leading with context, not control. And you know, how do you build a culture around that being the culture you want to build? But more so the personal mindset side of things. This is probably more common to people who like reading, like nonfiction, is Cal Newport, Deep Work, James Clear, Atomic Habits. It's the personal mindset stuff. And I've read Deep Work like a few years ago now, but I'm on this constant sort of journey of trying to find constant pockets in my calendar. I think you were talking about the 3-3-3 system, I think earlier, which is, you know, how do you lock in these pockets where it's just purely deep work? That's stuff where you're not going to get distracted from. So I'm sort of tend to always fall back to the personal mindset type books. And podcasts is definitely Diary of a CEO is the one I listen to most frequently. Daniel Priestley is another person I actually have read a couple of his books.
Dan's fabulous. He one of the co-founders of Dent Global, and wrote a book called Key Personal Influence.
That's the first book I read that he's written. There was another one I think I've come across as well, but yeah, that was the first book that really struck me. It was one of the earlier sort of business type books that I've read.
I should have it. Oversubscribed is the other one.
Oversubscribed. That's
and you know, and it's interesting. You know, the two people you mentioned there, the Diary of a CEO and Dan Priestley. I always have a coach. You know, I figure that, you know, if I'm selling CEO founder coaching, you know, I really need to be doing the same. So I've always had a coach, and this year Dan Priestley is actually my coach.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and his team. And in fact, I spent 2.5 hours on a live call with 30 other people at 11 o'clock this morning with the Dent team. And we were, if you look at my LinkedIn profile, Jonathan Herps. The 333 method you mentioned, that was a blog that I put out yesterday, I think. If you look at my content strategy, go back 25 work days, you'll see my content strategy changed dramatically 25 days ago. And lo and behold, I'm modeling it on the blog of the CEO, the Diary of the CEO, but focus very much on my perfect future customer, perfect future client, based on the Dan Priestley model. So I've crashed the two together, and with a bit of other things thrown in as well. And you'll see my content strategies have changed quite significantly in the last 25 work days. This podcast comes out of something that Dan Priestley said to me a year ago. And it's they've got this concept of 7-11-4. 11. Someone to buy from you, they need to. It's something like 7 pieces of content over 11 pieces of content over 4 mediums. So a lot of the stuff I'm doing now actually comes directly from Dan Priestley. I'd highly recommend those 2 books.
Yeah.
Really, it's significantly changed my business and the growth of my business positively since I've been doing this stuff.
Yeah.
So
I haven't read Oversubscribed fully. I'd started it, but I definitely need to go back and finish it, because his style as well is just, you read something and it almost sounds so simple, but it's like just the way he sort of frames things in general. You go, that makes perfect sense.
And look, he is a founder. With Dan, he's one of 3 founders, 3 co-founders, but he and his co-founders have now founded, I think it's 3 or 4 multi-million pound businesses in the space of about 8 years. He's definitely an entrepreneur worth following. Yeah. Okay, last question for you. Any last piece of advice or parting words to other business owners, entrepreneurs who are looking to grow?
Again, this is one of those things where there's probably too many to go through, but the 2 main things that come to mind is going back to something I said earlier, and it's this awareness piece right at the start of not surrounding yourself by like-minded people. Like, if you identify yourself as you're a founder who's more technical, then get someone who knows business, get someone who knows operations, get people who will challenge you rather than just agree with you. So it's really about surrounding yourself with the right team. And I think you've mentioned it earlier. But the other is, and this is something that's sort of fallen into that trap more recently, is I've heard this, and I know it sounds so out of left field, but I heard Will Smith, out of all people, once say this years ago that really, really resonated with me. And he said, it's not just purely about business, but he said, any problem that you're having in the world, like no matter what personal problem you're having, it's very unlikely that you're the first person to ever encounter this. Someone else would have encountered this problem and written it down somewhere and figured out a solution. So don't always try to reinvent the wheel. Actually sort of step out of that sort of closed mindset and go out and see how other people tackle this type of problem and look it up and read. Like I said, this actually goes beyond business, even like things like families and so on. And that's a real, when you think about it, it's true. How many problems do you have on a daily or a weekly or even annual basis that you think you're the only person in the world that's having that problem? Probably none. So it's,
yeah. Sorry, it's interesting you say that. I have a book in front of me, which is, it's called The Core Value Equation, by a guy called Darius Mershahazadeh. I butchered his surname. But one of the things, and it's absolutely on point to what you're talking about. And the reason I've got the book here is because I'm writing a blog on it right now. I use a concept called R&D, rip off and duplicate.
Okay, not the R&D I was thinking of.
No, rip off and duplicate, but I'll always give accreditation where I got it from.
Yeah.
I've got the book here because I learned that from him. He was listening. He had been introduced to a concept known as R&D by a very influential person who should remain nameless. Well, I've told you where I got it from. He said, when you see someone doing something well in their business that you wish you had in your business, just R&D it. Research and development, no. Rip off and duplicate. And you're absolutely spot on. Guaranteed someone has been out there, someone's approached the problem and come up with a solution. And I've got to tell you, ChatGPT, if you want to, AI, I think ChatGPT has provided me with a third-year research scientist in my business for $30 a month.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's definitely, but interesting that the rip-off and duplicate, it just immediately reminded me that, how many stories out there are about first to market is not often the idea of the business that succeeds. It's second to market that does, because they learn from everything the first, including the failures of the first to market, and then they do it better. I mean, that's Apple's model around a lot of the stuff that they do in terms of features where, they go, but Android has had this for 10 years, yet somehow, Apple still attracts that customers when those features come out. So it sort of resonates with that too.
And the other thing that comes out of that is, they who fail most are normally the ones that succeed. Yeah. And certainly in my career as a CEO, I've learned the most from where I failed. Yeah. Ali, as always, I've enjoyed the conversation, honestly. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And I, genuinely enjoyed our conversations. I'm sure we could have gone for another couple of hours.
And that's the problem. It's supposed to be a short form podcast, but, we get into conversations, and as you say, it could go for hours. But thank you again.
Thank you very much.
If you are hearing this message, you've listened to the entire episode. And for that, we want to thank you from the bottom of our hearts. We hope you enjoyed this new episode, and if you did, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you watch/listen. It helps this channel more than you know, and the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the learning gets. Please share this episode with others who may be interested in entrepreneur stories of scaling up. If you want to be a guest on the podcast, please send an email to admin@scaleupgrowth.co. Put "Be a guest" in the subject line and tell me a little about yourself. If you want to gauge where your business growth potential is and identify where the biggest opportunities in your business lie, or where the key needs that you need to concentrate on right now are, take our assessment where you will receive personalized advice for improvement. It's quick and free. Go to scaleupgrowth.scoreapp.com. If you would like to work with me one-to-one, I love coaching and get the best outcomes that way. Send me an email at jonathan@scaleupgrowth.co and put one-to-one in the heading. Tell me a bit about your business and let's see how we can apply a great strategy for your business. So that's it for this week. Tune in next time for more great learnings from a scaling entrepreneur.